This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you're watching is quieter than that and more dangerous. A rule is being rewritten in real time, not on paper, on the ground. It starts when power stops negotiating and starts administering, when borders become temporary, when sovereignty becomes conditional. You're told it's stabilization. You're told it's rebuilding. You're told it's necessary, but listen closely to what's actually changing. Control no longer follows law. It follows assets. And once that shift is normalized, it doesn't stay far away. It shows up in prices, in elections that feel hollow, in decisions you never voted on but still pay for. If this feels disconnected from your life, stay with me. That assumption is the trap. Because once force becomes a balance sheet, the question is no longer if it spreads, it's how fast. And who's next? Just keep watching. The system only works if you don't see the mechanism yet. Here's the mistake most people make. They think power still lives in offices, in speeches, in elections. It doesn't. Power now lives in control loops. Who turns something off, who turns it back on, and who never has to explain either move. What actually runs the system isn't ideology. It's throughput, energy, logistics, cash flow. When those are stable, politics becomes decoration. When they're seized, politics disappears. That's the shift you're watching. The center of gravity has moved away from voters and laws and toward whoever can physically secure infrastructure and keep it producing. Once that happens, legitimacy is no longer earned. It's asserted. You don't argue with it. You adjust to it. And the most dangerous part, this structure doesn't need chaos to function. It needs calm, order, predictable outcomes, which is why it's sold as efficiency, as competence, as getting things under control. But control of what is the question nobody asks out loud. Because once the system answers that, everything downstream changes, including you. And before you assume this is new or sudden, you need to see what quietly shifted first. That's next. This didn't begin with tanks or threats. That's the illusion. It began with normalization. Before, force was exceptional, rare, costly, something leaders explained. Now, it's procedural. Before, taking control meant occupation. Now, it's framed as management, oversight, a temporary fix that never seems to end. Before, sovereignty was assumed. Now, it's conditional on performance. Miss targets, lose capacity, fall behind. And suddenly, someone else is helping. This is how the shift hides no declaration, no single moment to point at, just a slow replacement of language. Invasion becomes stabilization. Seizure becomes rebuilding. Control becomes responsibility. And the most dangerous part is the pace. Fast change triggers resistance. Slow change trains acceptance. By the time people realize something fundamental moved, they're already living inside the new rules. That's why this doesn't feel like a crisis yet. It feels administrative, technocratic, almost boring, which is exactly how systems lock in. But normalized systems still produce shocks. And when the first real one hits, it doesn't look like a warning. It looks like success. That's where this turns. Then comes the moment that's supposed to prove it all works. Not a debate, not a vote. A demonstration, sudden, overwhelming, technically flawless. Assets are secured before questions are asked. Infrastructure is protected. Control is established in hours, not weeks. You're shown the precision, the coordination, the confidence, and you're told this is competence. Look how fast it happened. Look how clean it was. Look how much value was recovered almost instantly. That's the hook. Because speed creates legitimacy. And efficiency silences doubt. If it produces results, people stop asking how. If it generates money, people stop asking who authorized it. This is where the system reveals its first real symptom. Force doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as optimization. And once the machine proves it can seize, stabilize, and monetize without obvious resistance, the argument quietly ends. Not because everyone agrees, but because the next move is already in motion and it doesn't need permission. Here's the part you're not supposed to look at too closely, because once you do, the whole thing changes shape. The system doesn't run on ideology. It runs on capture. You secure the asset first, the physical thing that can't move, the well, the port, the grid. Then you route the output not back to the public, not through institutions, but through a chain that answers upward, not outward. This is where the winners become clear. Those who control extraction gain leverage. Those who manage flow gain permanence. And those on the ground absorb the risk, the disruption, the silence. It's elegant in a cold way. Revenue funds presence. Presence enforces control. Control guarantees revenue. A closed loop. And because the money starts flowing immediately, the operation pays for itself. That's the trick. Once force becomes profitable, it stops being temporary. And anyone caught inside that loop, workers, civilians, entire countries, is no longer a stakeholder. They're a variable, which means the next shock won't be about whether this works. It will be about how far it can scale. And that question is already being tested. Now the pace changes. Because once the loop is proven, the system stops hesitating. Pressure increases. Timelines compress. Tolerance disappears. Compliance is expected. Delay is treated as resistance. And resistance triggers escalation. Not speeches, signals. Assets freeze. Routes close. Support evaporates. Suddenly, entire structures wobble. Allies recalibrate. Dependents panic. Enemies go quiet, not because they're convinced, but because they're calculating. This is the moment when instability spreads sideways. Not as war, as imbalance. One disruption knocks another loose. One seized flow starves a second system. One success creates 3 new failures somewhere else. And none of it looks dramatic enough to stop, because every move is framed as maintenance, as keeping things running, as preventing something worse. That's how acceleration hides. By the time anyone realizes the costs are compounding, the system is already moving too fast to interrupt. And the damage doesn't announce itself where it starts. It surfaces where you least expect it. That's where you come in. This is where it stops being abstract. Because the system doesn't touch you through headlines. It reaches you through friction. You feel it when prices shift for reasons no one explains. When decisions appear finished before anyone asks your opinion, when outcomes arrive pre-approved, you're told this is stability, that things are calmer now. But calm isn't the same as consent. When control moves upstream away from voters and toward assets, your role changes. You're no longer the audience. You're the downstream effect. Your work adjusts. Your costs recalibrate. Your choices narrow, not because you failed, but because the system doesn't need your input to function anymore. And here's the uncomfortable part. Once people accept lower prices in exchange for lower agency, the trade becomes permanent. That's how leverage works. It's offered as relief first. If this feels familiar, it should. And if it makes you uneasy, that instinct matters. Because what happens next depends on whether people notice the pattern before it finishes locking in. Stay with me. The impact doesn't stop at one country or one economy. Once this system proves it can work in one place, it doesn't stay contained. It ripples. Supply chains reroute overnight. Old alliances lose leverage without a press release. Entire regions recalibrate around whoever controls the switch. What used to be diplomacy becomes dependency. Countries don't argue. They adapt. Because when access determines survival, principles become optional. This is how a local action becomes a global condition. Markets respond before governments do. Prices move faster than policy. And by the time leaders speak, the outcome is already baked in. What looks like coordination is often fear. What looks like agreement is often math. And the most destabilizing part is this: no one has to announce the new order. It enforces itself. Those with assets gain insulation. Those without them absorb volatility. And neutrality becomes impossible when flow is controlled elsewhere. At this stage, the system doesn't need expansion by force. It expands by gravity. Everything starts leaning toward the center of control, which raises the only question that actually matters now. What happens when this accelerates? Because it always does. From here, there are only three paths, not choices, outcomes. The first is adjustment. Systems bend without breaking. Control is normalized, priced in, and quietly accepted. People adapt. Institutions survive, thinner and weaker, but intact. The second is erosion. Small failures stack. Trust leaks out faster than it can be replaced. What was managed starts to fray. Maintenance becomes permanent crisis response. And then there's rupture. That's when the loop outruns itself. When too many systems depend on a single point of control, when one disruption cascades instead of correcting. Rupture doesn't announce itself with collapse. It arrives as overload, as simultaneous stress. Too many places pulling on the same lever. Too many promises backed by the same asset. And the danger here isn't which path we're on. It's that the system driving all three doesn't slow down to check. Acceleration feels like confidence right up until it isn't. And once that threshold is crossed, there's no clean exit. Which brings us to the part no one wants to say out loud. Because if this continues, the ending won't look like a decision. It will look like inevitability. There's a reason this never ends with relief. Because systems like this don't collapse from outrage. They harden through use. Every time it works, it teaches the wrong lesson. That speed is legitimacy. That control is competence. That outcomes matter more than consent. And once that lesson spreads, it doesn't stay optional. You don't get a vote on whether the model continues. You only find out how deeply it's already embedded. The danger isn't a single operation, or a single country, or a single leader. It's the precedent. A world where force becomes administration, where economics replaces law, where sovereignty is treated like a performance review. If this makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is awareness, because the next phase won't arrive as a shock. It will arrive as another solution, another optimization, another system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The only real question left is whether people recognize the pattern before it becomes the baseline. If you want to understand what comes after this, how this model spreads, and where it breaks, you'll need to keep going. Because once a system like this feels normal, reversing it is no longer a policy debate. It's a crisis.